Have you ever looked at modern life and asked yourself how we reached a point where comfort and prosperity are, for many, simply taken for granted? As always, if you want a deeper dive, we recommend buying and reading the entire book, Suicide of the West by Jonah Goldberg, through the link below, because nothing can replace experiencing the complete work yourself. Now let's explore some of the vital ideas from Goldberg's argument and see why he believes Western progress might be in more danger than we realize. Jonah Goldberg says that when we trace our history back just a few centuries, we see a world that was, for most people, unrecognizably grim. Life, as famously described by philosopher Thomas Hobbes, was nasty, brutish, and short. For millennia, humans lived in small tribal groups that faced constant threats from predators, hunger, and warfare. When agriculture emerged some 15,000 years ago, incredible changes began to unfold. Yet even that agricultural revolution wasn't the true miracle. The miracle, according to Jonah Goldberg, centers on what started happening in England in the late 17th century and spread throughout the West. Wealth skyrocketed, violence declined, new ideas flourished, and an entire society designed around constitutional rights and liberal institutions blossomed. It was so dramatic, Goldberg sees it as nothing short of miraculous that humans, who are by nature tribalistic, managed to build societies that fostered freedom, diversity of thought, and successful commerce on a massive scale. So what makes it a miracle? Goldberg highlights that humans do have moral instincts from birth, but we often also have deep-seated fears of the other. We can see in the behavior of young children that we're born with some moral sense, but we're also wired for tribal reactions and distrust of outsiders. And in societies that never developed strong institutions or remain cut off from modern ways, such as certain remote tribal communities, violence can run rampant due to this tribal legacy. Anthropologist Napoleon Chagnon's work among the Yanomamo in the Amazon, for instance, revealed an extraordinarily high rate of violence, with frequent killings not necessarily tied to practical resources, but to cultural norms that encourage aggression and warfare. The miracle is that countries like England began giving people ways to resolve disputes and channel their energies that replaced brutal clan warfare with structured law, individual rights, capitalism, and property protections. According to Jonah Goldberg, we should pay special attention to the role of England's common law in this transition. Under common law, a judge looks to previous precedents and established rights before deciding a case, which puts real limits on the authority of the monarch or any other powerful individual. He contrasts that with civil law traditions, common in continental Europe, that historically allowed absolute rulers to enact their will with fewer checks. Another factor making England fertile soil for the great liberal miracle was its geographic isolation as an island, which put less pressure on it to maintain large, expensive standing armies. Society naturally veered away from militarism toward more liberal structures, encouraging free commerce and a robust civil life filled with associations and voluntary organizations. This capacity for people to gather freely, forging connections around trade and individual pursuits, was precisely what Alexis de Tocqueville admired when he analyzed English and later American society. Once these ideas took root in England, the so-called miracle really took off, especially when they traveled across the Atlantic and shaped a new republic founded on Enlightenment principles, the United States of America. Jonah Goldberg says the United States represented a deliberate and carefully designed expression of these ideals. The founding fathers, people like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison, consciously embedded John Locke's convictions that government exists to protect life, liberty, and property, later famously tweaked to the pursuit of happiness, and that people are endowed with inalienable rights no monarch can take away. It was a bold experiment and a major triumph for the values we associate with the West. But Goldberg warns that the conditions ensuring these core values of liberal society are far more fragile than they seem. If humans are innately tribal, we need robust institutional structures to check that impulse. Property rights, free association, open debate, and nonviolent means of settling conflicts are institutions that hold back the darker side of our nature. When these institutions become weak, or when large groups turn against them, we risk reverting to the old, more primal patterns of tribalism, groupthink, and power struggles that can threaten the heart of our civilization. According to Goldberg, one major problem driving us toward this decline is that modern Western societies have lost touch with the miracle's core ideals. Let's focus on two key threats he outlines. The first is the growth of an unaccountable administrative state, and the second is the rise of identity politics and new forms of tribalism. Let's look at the first, the administrative state. Jonah Goldberg says that one defining moment for this administrative bloat in the United States was 1913, during Woodrow Wilson's presidency, when many social, economic, and regulatory agencies began to sprawl across the federal government. Far from being democratically controlled, these agencies ended up staffed by bureaucrats who typically have lifetime job security. You can vote out politicians, but the bureaucrats remain, shaping rules and regulations that apply to everyone else, while they themselves are rarely held accountable if they fail. Just look at the infamous Animas River incident, in which the Environmental Protection Agency dumped toxic waste into the water, but was found not liable. Goldberg sees that as an example of how institutionally shielded elites in the administrative state can cause harm without paying the price. These layers of regulation, licensing, and oversight can also stifle innovation. For instance, he points out that an occupation as simple as hair braiding can require hundreds or thousands of hours in training, complete with expensive licensing costs. This parallels medieval guild systems that inhibited newcomers and cut off potential advancement, even though the West had supposedly left guild mentalities behind centuries ago. The problem, Jonah Goldberg says, is that every time we expand these unaccountable bureaucracies, we drift further from the original liberal principles that made the miracle possible, principles like open competition and property rights. We're strangling the entrepreneurial spirit, limiting upward mobility, and discouraging people who might otherwise thrive. That, in turn, fosters economic stagnation and resentment, pushing voters to extremes and fueling populist anger. Another massive threat Goldberg explores is the rise of identity politics and the return of tribalism. Here, he looks at how America was once dedicated to a colorblind meritocracy, at least in principle. Martin Luther King Jr.'s dream was that people be judged on character, not on skin color or other superficial differences. Yet as Goldberg sees it, modern-day left-wing identity politics is undermining this colorblind ideal by insisting that one's group identity, be it racial, gender-based, or otherwise, shapes every aspect of a person's worth. Goldberg warns that identity politics can't help but create new divisions and entrench old ones, because it basically treats human beings as members of tribes rather than as individuals with rights and responsibilities. Paradoxically, Jonah Goldberg says this contributed to the rise of Donald Trump, because some historically unmarked groups, like white, working-class middle Americans, felt newly marked and attacked due to language about privilege, race, and gender. These people in turn formed their own tribal identities and expressed that anger at the polls. It's a case of one tribe feeding another tribe's motivation. The more the left pushes identity politics that emphasize differences, the more the right may respond by defining a white or Christian or nationalist identity in opposition. Multiply that 1,000-fold, and you get widespread tribal breakdown, with each group feeling victimized and suspicious of the others. Eventually, we lose sight of the ideas that created modern liberal democracy, such as seeing all citizens as equals under the law who share in the freedoms of a constitutional republic. That's precisely what Goldberg means by suicide of the West. We're watching a civilization that soared to unprecedented wealth and freedom begin pulling itself apart. Goldberg, however, doesn't see all elites as a bad thing. He distinguishes between the concept of a real aristocracy of merit, such as the Founding Fathers initially envisioned, where individuals rise through actual achievements, and a corrupt class of elites that use their entrenched power to block new talent. Consider historical examples like Venice, which started as a merit-based republic, but later locked itself into a closed hereditary aristocracy. Or in more modern contexts, we see well-connected university graduates filling bureaucratic positions, rarely held to accountability, and handing down regulations to the rest of the population. All of it moves society away from the energetic, open system that underpinned the miracle. Jonah Goldberg says we must revisit the bedrock values of the Constitution to reverse the self-destructive course we're on. The founders put checks and balances in place so no single interest group or governmental branch could dominate. But if Americans, both ordinary citizens and those in power, lose faith in the process and treat the Constitution as an archaic relic, or if they champion tribal identity over the rule of law, the entire system is imperiled. For Goldberg, one vital source of stability is the family. It's in the family, he says, that children can learn moral restraint and the basics of cooperation, hopefully building a bulwark against tribal impulses. But even the family institution is under stress in a society where political anger, consumerism, and bureaucratic expansion can crowd out core values. Goldberg also points to cultural codes, like shared senses of responsibility and civility, that historically helped hold us together. When these codes fade, raw human nature reemerges in all its tribal hostility. Relying on America's Constitution alone isn't enough if people have lost the emotional, moral, and psychological commitment to liberal democracy. The end result could be an America that stops believing in property rights, due process, or colorblind fairness. It's a grim possibility, one that Goldberg calls the suicide of the West, in which free societies willingly dismantle the frameworks that once let them flourish. That might seem overly dramatic, but consider the current polarization on so many fronts, with populists denouncing elites, progressive activists pushing identity-based agendas, and distrust in the very idea of objective law. Jonah Goldberg wants us to realize that the fact we have flush toilets, reliable food supplies, functional hospitals, the internet, all these blessings didn't just appear out of nowhere. They are the product of centuries of progress fueled by liberal values. If we let tribalism and unchecked bureaucracy dismantle the miracle, it could eventually mean living in a world uncomfortably reminiscent of the old, nasty, brutish, and short era Hobbes described. If you want to protect Western ideals, Jonah Goldberg says, you must know how they arose, how easily they can crumble without constant vigilance, and what you can do in your own life, such as defending freedom of speech and assembly, supporting genuine merit over identity, respecting the Constitution, and valuing the moral guidelines passed down through families and communities. For Goldberg, remembering that human nature can easily slide back into tribalism is key to truly valuing liberal institutions. But again, if you want to dive deeper into every aspect of his research, perspective, and conclusions, we recommend you buy and read the entire book, Suicide of the West by Jonah Goldberg, at the link below. Because while these ideas might feel lofty, Goldberg insists there's an urgent need for all citizens to understand them, lest we slip too far to recover. Thank you for sticking with us all the way through. Hopefully, you gained new insights into how the West achieved a once unthinkable level of prosperity, why those achievements risk unraveling, and what might be done about it in our era. Learning about the Enlightenment, the origins of liberal democracy, the rise of identity politics, and the administrative state's gradual stranglehold offers a clearer picture of what we stand to lose if we don't value and preserve our freedoms. And as always, we encourage you to purchase and read Jonah Goldberg's Suicide of the West in its entirety through the link provided. Nothing matches the depth and breadth of reading a full book, especially one that deals with complex social and political challenges the way Jonah Goldberg's does.